I'm convinced if we're going to accomplish the Jesus mission, we need church planners with a dream of planting churches that will mobilize every person for mission, and a church that is reproducing over and over and over again. We cannot keep doing the same things the same way and expect different outcomes. Isaiah 43 tells us, "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing."
Words and noise. Our culture is filled with words and noise. So I want to take a few words to talk about the value of decreasing the number of words and the amount of noise in your life. I want to talk about silence. And I want to go back to my freshman year in college. And a former Roman Catholic priest named Brennan Manning came and did a week of teaching. And he talked about healing our image of God. And at that point in time, my journey, from my perspective, I was a radically devoted, flat-out Jesus freak. But he got done with his first talk. And at the end of that 40-minute session, I was undone. I had this sense that there was something so profoundly central and important that somehow in all of my years of devotion, I had missed. And it was the grace of God. It was the unconditional love of God. It was an intellectual concept for me, but that day as Brennan talked, the Spirit of God used him and those words to pull back the veil on the image of God that hung in the hall of my heart. And I could see how misshapen and atrophied and small it was. And it began a lifelong repentance for me of discovering my belovedness. And Brennan was an amazing companion, a mentor from afar in that journey. I began to read all of his books, and back then it was actually still cassette tapes, so I had all these cassette tapes of Brennan that I would listen to. And it ended up, over the years, 4 or 5 different times, I ended up in retreat settings with him. And what was funny is I desperately wanted to be his friend, but he didn't like me. Which, if you knew me, you'd probably understand why he didn't like me. I mean, it was really something. And I think what he understood was I was kind of a super fan. I was like, Brennan is the bomb. And I think he understood I was confusing the conduit for the source of grace. So, but God used him to bring this healing to my image of God, discovering him as my Abba, as my daddy. And I went to be a part of this church plant, and the thing took off like a rocket ship, and it was hundreds, and then it was thousands. And there was this point where the staff was feeling really fatigued. And I said, you know, if we could have Brennan come in with the staff team and do a retreat, that would be amazing. And I called Brennan, and because we were so close, he didn't actually remember me. And I said, Brennan, hey, would you be willing to come in and do a retreat for us? And he said, I would. But it would be under one condition. And I said, what would that be? And he said, no one would be allowed to bring a Bible. And I was like, okay, this guy's a former Roman Catholic priest. There's the whole Reformation thing. Maybe he doesn't understand sola scriptura. You know, I was like, wait a second. What do you mean we couldn't bring our Bibles? That's interesting. Can you explain it? And he said these words, and I'll never forget it. He said, the reason I don't want you to bring your Bibles is because too many successful church leaders hide from God in their Bibles. Think about that. Jesus said it this way: you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. And here's what I think Jesus was saying, and what Brennan was saying, that it is very possible in any form of religious activity to hide from God. And as church leaders, this is especially dangerous for us. I think it was Leonard Ravenhill who said it's very easy to miss the Lord of the work because we're doing the work of the Lord. And I want to talk about how any kind of good work, any religious activity, which our lives are filled with because we're religious professionals, how it can so easily become a way for us to hide from God. When we're achieving, when we're activating, when we're performing, when we're managing, I'm telling you, it is so easy to hide from God. Just a week ago, I got up in the morning and I was doing my normal prayer routine. And there was some a relational situation and a financial situation that was creating a lot of anxiety in me. And so I was praying through it. I was doing some intense intercession over it. And 30, 40 minutes of prayer and no release on the anxiety. I was finally like, forget it. These prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. I go downstairs. My wife's there. It's still early in the morning. And she's like, how you doing this morning, honey? And I was like, I'm doing good, babe. How you doing? And I sit down and realize, yeah, I just flat out lied to my wife. I'm really not doing good at all. And I said to her a couple minutes later, I'm sorry, babe, I lied to you. I'm actually not doing good. I'm really, she was aware, of course, the relational situation, the financial situation. I said, I'm really stressed out about it. I just prayed for 40 minutes, got no release at all. And she looked at me and she said, well, I was just praying through this prayer, and she read it to me. And it was a prayer about surrendering your mind, your heart, your will, and even your body. And she said, maybe you should give this a shot. So I went over into the other room, and as I began to pray through that prayer, within minutes, I could feel the anxiety just melt. And what I saw in that moment, it was the time I had in prayer earlier in the morning. It was actually about me trying to control God. It was actually about me performing to try to earn a certain response out of God. And I realized for those 30 or 40 minutes, I was actually hiding from God the whole time. And it wasn't until I went into this more surrendered form of prayer that I began to see I was hiding. And I'm telling you, I've hidden from God when I'm preaching. I've hidden from God when I've been leading meetings. I've hidden from God in strategy meetings where we're talking about the future. And I want to ask you as a church leader to think about how dangerous that is and how seductive that is. And with that in mind, and I think you're probably aware right now of how often it is we subconsciously just slip into that space where it's about earning and activating and achieving, improving, and image management. And that is the context that we live in. And I think the most subversive act of rebellion against that is the act of silence. And so I want to just talk just for a little bit about the subversive act of silence. I think is one of the most subversive, resistant acts we can engage in as a church leader. See, in silence, we enter into a space where earning, achieving, performing, managing, they're not even a part of the vocabulary. When we go into silence and solitude, we enter into a space where it's, it's not possible for me to knock something else off of my to-do list. We go into a space where performing becomes completely irrelevant. We enter into a place where we can just be unhurried in the presence of God. And we desperately need this space. Listen, about 2 years ago, I moved to Westside Family Church in Kansas City, and the NewThing tribe in Kansas City is going and growing, and two of the guys who have a really apostolic role in that area are Dan Sutherland and Troy McMahon. And Dan Sutherland's been a mentor in my life for years. And many of you have probably heard of Dan Sutherland. He's had a best-selling book. He's literally trained hundreds of thousands of church leaders. I affectionately refer to him as the godfather of the Christian mafia. I mean, he's one of these guys who knows everybody. He's connected, incredibly influential. And when Dan was inviting me to consider being a part of the team at Westside and moving to Kansas City, one of the things that drew me actually to Westside was Dan's story. And here's a Dan who's a guy who's extraordinarily successful. But if you would talk to Dan right now and ask him, what is perhaps the most transformative, profoundly important habit or rhythm in your life? He would tell you, chair time. Chair time. In other words, you put your butt in a chair and you get quiet and you get silent and you let God love you. And you simply listen. And sometime if you get a chance, Dan has a book, it's called Chair Time. It's just a short ebook. You could read it probably in 40 minutes. And he tells the story about his friend, his coach, his mentor, who confronted him at one point in time. And when he was at a really kind of dark space in his life, he was kind of ready to pack it in at Westside. He was thinking about getting in his truck and kind of just driving away. And his friend did this sort of Jesus jiu-jitsu move on him. He said, Dan, I know you've been praying about it, but I've noticed something about your prayer life, that it's all about you. And it's a one-way conversation. He basically said, do you ever call someone and you just go, hey, hello, it's me, how you doing, blah, 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 click, and then hang up? It's not a very engaging conversation for the other person. And he said, Dan, I think that's kind of what your prayer life is like. You've been praying about this dark space in your life, but I don't think it's actually a conversation. It's a monologue, not a dialogue. And he challenged Dan that every day to sit in at least 20 to 30 minutes of silence on his porch and not talk, but simply listen to God. And you can read the story in chair time, and I hope you will, but Dan went a month, and he said it felt like the most useless, futile waste of time that he'd ever experienced. He was on the last day of the last month, just ready pretty much just to give up. And he had a breakthrough into a sense of his belovedness and a clarity in terms of hearing the voice of God that he would tell you has really changed the whole trajectory of his life. And I'm telling you, we need chair time desperately. And I want to challenge you through this time to consider taking 20 minutes a day just to go into the silence, to sit in a chair and realize you have a spot right in front of the throne of grace where you can sit. And you don't have to perform. You don't have to have any words to prove anything or earn anything. You can simply sit and be loved and listen. And it is a subversive act. Here's why. You know, it's an act of resistance because we live in a culture that tells us we are what we do. And see what silence will do, it will unhinge you from that whole system that tries to convince you what you've done is never enough. It will disengage you from this dominant culture imagination that says you are what you do and you are what other people think of you. And that is the water that we swim in every day. We are told our identity equals what I do times what other people think of me. And silence and solitude is this environment where we basically give that way of thinking the finger and say, I'm not buying into it. I'm unplugging from the matrix. You know, you think of Israel for 400 years in slavery, and you know the Pharaoh's boot in Egypt is on their neck, and they are being told, you are the brick makers. You exist to produce bricks, and your identity is you are slaves. And some old preacher said it. I don't know who it was, but it took God one night to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took God 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. And he took them out into the wilderness because he needed for them to go through a time of detox, because they had been told day after day, week after week, year after year, generation after generation, you are what you do. You make bricks. And you are who we say you are. You are slaves. And God took them out into the wilderness, into the silence, into the solitude to say, no, you're my beloved. You're my people. You're the light of the world. And I'm telling you, you need that lonely wilderness space every day so you can experience again your belovedness, so that you can know your identity is not attached to what you do or what others think of you. And when you're in a public ministry role, I'm telling you, the platform is not a neutral space. It has a downward momentum. It has a gravity that pulls you into that old paradigm that says, I am what I do. I am what other people think of me. And you have to, as an act of resistance, go into the silence and say, I'm unplugging from that matrix. And let me also say this to you. Silence is an act of resistance against a three-tiered universe mindset. Now, I'm admitting my geekery here when I'm using a phrase like three-tiered universe. But the ancients, the way the cosmology worked was they saw the world as three tiers. There was the heavens, there was the earth, and then there was the underworld. And this is embedded into the scriptures, the cosmology of the scripture. Now, we know in modern times we've sent men actually in spaceships. We know that isn't actually the physical landscape of our universe, but this primitive way of thinking. That heaven is up there, earth is down here, then there's the underworld below. We have this way of pushing God out there. God is in heaven, up there, and we are on earth, down here. And it's deeply entrenched inside of us. Now, don't misunderstand me. God is absolutely transcendent. I mean, God is above and beyond and more than us. There is this veil between heaven and earth, and it won't be fully removed until heaven and earth collide at the return of Jesus, and they commingle completely, and the veil is torn. But here's what I want to say. That mindset is a primitive mindset, and it's unbiblical, this idea that God is out there. In fact, I'm so tired of worship songs that are like, oh God, come down. Oh God, be present in this place. Oh God, let your presence come among us. It's old school. It's like God is already here. God is already present. We don't need God to show up. We need to show up. We need to wake up. God is here. And Paul said it this way. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? God is not out there. He's right here, right now. And we get 1,440 minutes a day. And I think in every single one of those, God is saying to us, I am. I am. I am. And the real question is this, am I here? I mean, God's here. Am I? Am I present? Am I aware? Or am I hiding? Am I hiding in the opinions of others? Am I hiding in the work that I do? And silence is this act of resistance that says, I'm not going to live in this illusion of a three-tiered universe. God is here, and I want to be here with him, fully present. So I want to encourage you to take some small steps. Let me make some real practical suggestions. One, I really want to encourage you. Type in Dan Sutherland Chair Time. That book could take you 30 or 40 minutes to read, and it'll help you see one man's journey moving into the silence. Check that out. Secondly, there's a couple apps that I found really helpful. One's called 5-Minute Meditation. This one's really good for sort of priming the pump. If you've never done this kind of meditative, contemplative practice, it's a great little on-ramp. There's another one called the Centering Prayer app. It'll take you farther and deeper. And it's got all the tools and the resources to kind of train you on how to do this. Those are two great apps, 5-Minute Meditation, Centering Prayer. Also, I want to encourage you to check out the Prayer of Examine. This has been so powerful for me. This is a form of prayer that's about 500 years old. It was developed by Ignatius of Loyola. He was a Spanish knight. He got injured in a battle. While he was recovering, he read the Gospels over and over and over again. He met the risen Jesus. He started this radical society of Jesus freaks called the Jesuits. One of their kind of core monastic values was imaginative prayer. And the Prayer of Examine is you sit down at the end of the day. It's usually about 20 minutes. And first of all, you just recall the presence of God. Like for me, I'll just say the simple words, I am, I am. It's his name. It reminds me he's here, he's present. You do that for a few minutes to kind of clear your head. And then you do kind of a review of your day. You recall the day through the lens of gratitude. You just think of all the little gifts God gave you. The smell of the cup of coffee in the morning, the laugh of your kid, the project that went well at work. And you just thank God for those things. You just touch on them with a sense of gratitude. And then you do what they call a review of the day. You run the day like a little movie in your head. And you look through 3 lenses at that movie. The first one is, where did I miss you, Lord? Where were you present, but I wasn't present? And again, it's not a time to analyze it. It's just a time to become aware of, it was that moment and that moment and that one and that one. I missed you. The second one is, where did I meet you today? Where did I love well today? And then you celebrate how you partnered with God, where he was at work. And then the last one, and this one's really powerful, what are my habitual behaviors? And what is the emotional space underneath it? And why is that a habit? Is it helping me become a more loving person? And then you just sit with Jesus. So that first part usually takes me about 15, 20 minutes, and then it's like a 5 or 10 minute conversation with Jesus. And what it does is by reviewing the past day, it helps you practice and get a feel for what it would be like to be present in the next day. Those are all really powerful next steps. And let me just give you this word of encouragement. People that have gone this way into silence, into contemplation, they recommend you start with about 20 minutes a day. And don't be discouraged, because typically the first month, 2 months, 3 months, you know what's going to happen a lot when you go into the silence? All these voices are going to start talking in your head, all the narcissistic scripts. Henry Nouwen describes it as the monkeys in the tree. they chatter and they yell and they scream at you. And you're going to have to learn a new set of muscles how to quiet those voices. And it's worth it. And it might, a month or two in, feel like, man, this isn't working. All I hear is this chatter, but it's working. Stay at it. Because you know what? I think silence is an act of resistance that makes us really dangerous in the right kind of way. It frees us. It takes us into the reality of amazing grace. And in closing, I want to read something to you. This is written by a church planter out in San Diego. It's powerful. In silence, we experience the God who says yes to our lives before we do anything. In silence, we experience the God who delights in our presence and whose delight is not connected to our performance. In silence, we understand that real change comes not from trying harder, but by better allowing ourselves to be loved. In silence, we discover that we already have everything we desire and need. In silence, we encounter the God we spend so much time talking about. In silence, we feast at the very table we have given our lives to setting and inviting others to. Silence is about learning how to preach the gospel without losing our souls. And the best thing we have as church leaders to offer our spouses, our families, our faith communities, our cities, and the world is the Jesus transformed version of ourselves. And I'm convinced that happens best in silence. So may your souls flourish in silence, and may you step into the silence this week.